Series of lecture videos on igneous rocks and volcanoes. In the first video, we talked about magma and how to generate magma. In the second video, we talked about igneous texture, which is one of the ways we identify igneous rocks. Igneous composition is the second way we use to identify igneous rocks. So that's what we're going to talk about today is igneous composition. And igneous composition, which is what the chemicals inside of the igneous rock, those are defined by generally defined by where your magma is moving through, what kind of tectonic boundary is generating your magma, right? And that in turn will define the viscosity of your magma, which in turn defines how dangerous of an eruption you have at your volcano, right? So viscosity is a measure of resistance to flow, right? And a magma with higher viscosity has a higher resistance to flow. And that resistance to flow can be affected by temperature. Think of warming up honey before you pour it. Makes it less resistant to flow, right? It reduces its viscosity. Adding more silica will make your magma more viscous. It's like adding more sugar to your molasses. It makes it more viscous. And then finally, dissolved gases can change how your eruption occurs, and it interacts with viscosity very well. And I have a great video showing that as an experiment, and I'll put a link to that in this presentation. And that's the link to the video there. So let's move on here. And then if you watch the minerals lecture, you would notice that we went through the trouble of mentioning dark silicates, which are associated with mafic rocks, which is a type of igneous composition. Those are rich in iron and magnesium, and include olivine, pyroxene, and amphiboles, and biotites. And then light silicates, which are known as felsic type composition. And those are more rich in quartz, potassium, and sodium, and calcium, right? And they represent the minerals quartz and muscovite, feldspars. They're much more silica rich. And so we can classify our igneous rocks based on the amounts of these minerals and these chemicals. And you can have a fairly significant range of silica in the crust. And based on this amount of silica, that's how we categorize our composition into two major groups. And then there's other groups that kind of fit in between on the ends of that. You have a felsic type composition, also known as granitic, right? And these are very high in silica content. They make for a very viscous, thick magma, and they erupt at lower temperatures. That's important. And then you can have a mafic magma, which has a lower silica content. It is more fluid of a flow, less viscous. And then it erupts at higher temperatures, requires higher temperatures for melting, things like that. So here is kind of the different major categories of igneous composition. You can have mafic. There's also ultramafic, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail. There's intermediate, which is the creative name for in between the two major compositions, and felsic. And this mafic has the least amount of silica. Felsic has the most amount of silica. And here's an ultramafic rock. This is a dunite or peridotite, and it's green from olivine. Here's the mineral olivine, I think commonly known in the gem world as peridot. And this is very close to the composition of what our mantle is like. So very, very mafic, ultramafic, right? Here's some ultramafic rocks, right? So the extrusive version, so that we talked about textures in the last lecture, that's tiny microscopic crystals. We call that basalt, or an intrusive version we call gabbro. These are rich with magnesium and ferrum, also known as iron. So mafic, right? Dark silicates, high density. These are essentially ocean type crust, for those of you who are familiar with plate tectonics and the types of crust, right? A lot of volcanic islands are associated with these mafic rocks. Here's some basalt. I mentioned that earlier. Very, very common extrusive igneous rock. The upper layers of our oceanic crust. And then gabbro, the intrusive variation of that. So it just has larger, more visible crystals. In most of the magma that erupts, if you take into consideration the mid-ocean ridges, is basalt, right? Coming from these divergent plate boundaries where you're generating new plate. And they originate from partial melting of the mantle, this decompression melting. And they're commonly known as primary or primitive magmas because they're very similar to where they originate from, which is the mantle, right? They have low silica and low viscosities. They flow very readily. And here's some of the textures you can see in some of these basalt flows. Your and pohoihoi, a ropey type magma, and this is more like a spiky, pointy type magma. I have a YouTube link here to some of that eruption style of a mafic type eruption, right? And here's the type of volcanoes they generate. These what's known as shield volcanoes, very broad, gently sloping volcanoes, and that has a lot to do with the viscosity of the magma, which in turn has to do with the composition, right? Has low viscosity, so flows very readily, and that ready flow makes for broad, dome-shaped type volcanoes. And these are still dangerous eruptions, but they're not as explosive as a felsic type eruption would be, right? And then some examples are the Hawaiian Islands, Canary Islands, Galapagos Islands, Easter Islands, which I think are all hot spots. But you can have mafic flows in other places, but these are great examples of that type of volcano. And then you can also get these cinder cone volcanoes from mafic compositions. And some great examples are in Craters of the Moon National Monument, which is in Arco, Idaho area, and there's some in Vail, Utah. Me being out of Utah, it's good to mention some local areas. And these are a little bit more gas rich, so they have very vesicular cinders erupting out of these, but still mafic in composition. And I have a video linked here on Paracutin, which was a fairly famous Mexican cinder cone eruption, right? So in terms of composition, we also have these intermediate rocks, the extrusive version being andesite, which is like a grayish looking rock. It's volcanic in origin, right? Sometimes it's porphyritic, and then it's intrusive, same composition, but the intrusive variation is known as diorite, and it looks like a Dalmatian. It's kind of a salt and pepper appearance, and it lacks visible quartz, and it's coarse grain for the diorite. And then finally, the felsic composition, and these are lighter in color, and there's usually always visible quartz, right? And they're high in silica content, which means it makes the magma very viscous. And here's a beautiful example of a granite with quartz and K feldspar, and its extrusive equivalent known as rhyolite, microcrystalline. You can see some little quartz phenocrysts floating around in that, right? Typically buff, pink, or light gray in color. And a lot of times this is weathered readily, so it might be altered, sometimes altered hydrothermally, so it could be hard to recognize in some cases. And then, you could talk about pyroclastic rocks like obsidian as well. So this is considered a felsic type pyroclastic rock, silica rich, but did not have time to grow crystals. It was quenched at the Earth's surface. And that leaves us to the volcano type for felsic and intermediate rocks, which is the stratovolcano. We'll talk about these a little bit more when we talk about volcanic hazards, but these are your classic movie type volcano, also known as composite volcanoes, right? Nice symmetrical cone, and they're created from these interbedded lava flows and eruptions. And Mount St. Helens is a prime example since it's erupted recently in 1980. And I have some great video links in our slides on some stratovolcanoes erupting. And I think we'll end with this GIF on Mount St. Helens and its ash flow and landslide. pulled together by Gary Rosenquist. So thank you very much for listening on the different types of volcanic compositions, and we'll talk about volcanic hazards in the next lecture.